Trust isn't a luxury in the void. Out here, survival is currency, and alliances are forged in desperation, not honor. I've faced horrors in the depths of space, walked on haunted worlds, and fought shadows that shouldn't exist, but this was different. This time, I needed help, and the only ones willing to give it were the last people I wanted to trust, the Black Nebula, a notorious band of space pirates. It all started with a transmission, garbled, frantic, and worse, familiar. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Carly Vega, one of my oldest allies, presumed dead for over a year after her ship vanished near the edge of the Veil Nebula. Her message was brief, but it hit like a plasma blast. Rogers, I don't have much time. They're here. They found us. Sector 9, abandoned outpost, please. The signal cut out, replaced by static. She's alive, I said, gripping the console. Captain, Darnell said, his voice cautious. If that's really Vega, why hasn't she contacted us before now? And why there? The Veil Nebula's crawling with pirates, I finished. Yeah, I know. The Veil Nebula wasn't just dangerous. It was a graveyard. Ships went in and didn't come out, and those that did often came back changed. Something out there hunted in the dark, and now Vega was trapped in the middle of it. Space doesn't let you forget. Not the faces of those you've lost. Not the choices that haunt you, and definitely not the debts you owe to the void. When I first heard Vega's voice crackle through the comms, I thought it was a glitch. After all, I'd buried the memory of her with the rest of my regrets a year ago, when her ship vanished without a trace. The fact that she was alive and calling from the Veil Nebula of all places shook me to my core. But the part that truly unsettled me was the fear in her voice. Vega wasn't the kind of person to scare easily. Rogers trapped, they're here shadows. The transmission looped again, the static distorting her words but not her terror. Captain, Darnell said from the comm station, his face pale under the glow of the console. This could be anything. A trick, a trap, or just interference. It's her, I said, my voice firmer than I felt. I know her voice. Darnell frowned. Even if it is, you know where this is coming from, right? The Veil isn't just dangerous. It's suicidal. He wasn't wrong. The Veil Nebula wasn't just a graveyard. It was a predator's den. Ships disappeared there with unsettling frequency, and the few that made it out brought stories of shadows that moved without light and whispers that invaded your thoughts. You want to ignore this? I asked, turning to him. He didn't answer. We convened in the mess hall, a sterile, steel-lined room that usually felt like a sanctuary in the void. Tonight, it felt smaller, the shadows longer. Vega's alive, I said, cutting to the chase. And she's calling from the Veil Nebula. The reactions were immediate. Jenkins, our engineer, cursed under his breath. Vega, our medic and the namesake of the missing lieutenant, leaned forward, her brows furrowing. She's alive? She asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. I wouldn't stake our lives on it, Jenkins interjected. That place that's cursed. It's not curses we're worried about, I said. It's what's hunting out there, and we're not going in blind. What's the plan, Captain? Vega asked, her tone steady despite the tension in the room. The Black Nebula, I said simply. The silence that followed was heavier than the void outside. You're joking, Jenkins said finally, his laugh more nervous than amused. Pirates? You're gonna trust pirates. We don't have a choice, I said. They know the Veil. They've mapped it, and they're the only ones who can get us in and out alive. And if they decide to rob us blind, Darnell asked. I met his gaze. Then they'll learn what happens when you cross me. The Black Nebula's stronghold was an asteroid hollowed out and repurposed into a makeshift fortress. As we approached, the nebula's grace too was dwarfed by the sheer size of the asteroid, its surface bristling with salvage weaponry. This place screams bad idea, Jenkins muttered as we entered the docking bay. The hangar was a chaotic mess of cobbled-together ships, their patchwork hulls a testament to the pirates' resourcefulness, or desperation. My crew stood tense as the airlock hissed open, the metallic clang echoing ominously. Kale Torg waited for us at the other end of the gangway, flanked by a handful of his crew. He was taller than I'd expected, his cybernetic eye glowing faintly in the dim light. His smile was more a baring of teeth than a gesture of welcome. "Captain Rogers," he said, his voice a gravelly drawl. "To what do I owe the honor of this unexpected visit?" "I need your help," I said, cutting straight to the point. Torg laughed, a deep, guttural sound. "And here I thought you'd come to surrender that shiny ship of yours. What makes you think we're in the helping business?" "Because I'm offering you something better than credits," I replied, stepping closer. Torg's crew surrounded us, their weapons visible but not yet raised. The air was thick with tension, every word a potential spark. "You've got my attention," Torg said, leaning against a crate with a mockingly casual air. "What's worth more than credits to me?" "An abandoned colonial outpost in the Veil," I said. "Weapons, tech, supplies, yours for the taking. All I need is safe passage." The room fell silent. The Veil was a dangerous place, even for pirates. But danger had a way of appealing to their greed. "You're serious?" Torg said, studying me with his cybernetic eye. "Deadly," I replied. Torg smirked, his gaze flicking to my crew. "And what's stopping me from taking your ship and using it to loot the place myself?" "3 things," I said, holding up my fingers. 1, you don't know where the outpost is. 2, you won't survive the Veil without us. And 3, I leaned closer, my voice low. "You'll die trying." Torg's smirk widened into a grin. "I like you, Rogers. You've got guts." He extended a hand, his cybernetic fingers whirring softly. "You've got a deal." The pirates boarded the Nebula's Grace 2, much to the dismay of my crew. They didn't trust them, and neither did I, but I didn't have to like them to use them. "You've got a lot of shiny toys here," one of Torg's men said, running a hand along the console in the engine room. "Touch anything and I'll break your fingers," Jenkins snapped, his glare enough to send the pirate retreating. "You sure about this, Captain?" Vega asked as we prepared for departure. "No," I admitted, "but it's the only chance we've got." The journey to the Veil Nebula was uneventful, but the tension aboard the ship was palpable. The pirates were rowdy and unpredictable, their crude humor grating on the nerves of my already uneasy crew. But when we reached the edge of the Veil, the mood shifted. Even the pirates fell silent as the swirling clouds of gas and debris came into view. The nebula was beautiful in its own way, but there was something about it that set my teeth on edge. "This is it," Torg said, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. "Welcome to the Veil." The Nebula's Grace 2 followed the scavengers falling into the nebula, its shield straining against the radiation and turbulence. The swirling colors outside the viewport were mesmerizing, but the unease in my gut only grew stronger. "Captain," Darnell said, his voice tight, "I'm picking up something. Movement." "What kind of movement?" I asked. He shook his head. "It's erratic. Not ships. Something else." Torg's voice crackled over the comms. "Stay sharp, Rogers. The Veil has a way of playing tricks on you." "Define tricks," I replied. "You'll see soon enough," he said, and the comms went silent as we ventured deeper into the Veil. The shadows outside the ship seemed to move. At first, I thought it was just a swirling gas, but then I saw them, faint, humanoid shapes flickering in and out of the nebula's light. "Captain," Vega said, her voice trembling, "are you seeing this?" "Yeah," I said, gripping the console tighter. The radar lit up with blips, dozens of them, moving erratically around the ship. "They're closing in," Darnell said, his voice barely above a whisper. The Nebula's Grace 2 shuddered as something slammed into the hull. "What the hell was that?" Jenkins shouted. The answer came in the form of a grotesque, spider-like creature crawling across the viewport, its many eyes glowing with a sickly green light. The first encounter with the shadow creatures set the tone for what was to come. The Veil Nebula wasn't just a graveyard. It was alive, and it didn't take kindly to intruders. The ship's alarms blared as the grotesque, spider-like creature skittered across the nebula's gray tooth hull. Its glowing green eyes glared at us, a flickering, alien intelligence behind them. "Get it off the ship," I shouted, gripping the console as Darnell scrambled to bring the turret systems online. The external cannons hummed to life, firing a precise burst. The creature exploded into a cloud of black, viscous matter, splattering across the viewport. But before we could breathe, more blips appeared on the radar, dozens of them swarming like a pack of predators. "We've got more incoming," Jenkins yelled, his face pale as he stared at the growing mass of shadows outside. Torik's voice crackled over the comms. "Welcome to the Veil, Rogers. Enjoying the show? This is more than you told us." I snapped, fury rising in my chest. Torik chuckled darkly. "You should have asked more questions. The creatures didn't just attack our ship. They toyed with us. They darted in and out of visibility, their forms flickering like broken holograms. One moment, they were humanoid. The next, they twisted into shapes that defied logic, their limbs elongating, their eyes multiplying. The Scavenger's Fong, Torik's pirate flagship, fought back with brute force, its crude weapons blasting into the swarm. But for every creature they destroyed, more emerged from the swirling nebula, drawn by something unseen. "What the hell are these things?" Jenkins shouted as another creature slammed into the ship's hull, sending a shudder through the deck. "They're not biological," Vega said, her hands trembling as she analyzed the readings on her console. "They're energy, pure energy, manifesting into physical form. Whatever they are, they don't like visitors," Darnell muttered, firing another volley from the turrets. Torik's voice came through again, this time with a hint of unease. "Rogers, your crew better keep their wits about them. The Veil likes to play tricks." "Tricks?" I barked. "Like what?" "Just don't trust what you see," Torik replied. "Or what you hear." The deeper we went into the Veil, the stranger things became. The shadows outside weren't just creatures. They were intelligent, and they were learning. The first sign was the whispers. At first, they were faint, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from the edges of our comms. But as we descended deeper into the nebula, the voices grew louder, more insistent. "Rogers." The voice was distorted, but unmistakable. It was Vega. Not the Vega on my crew, but the Vega who had sent the distress signal. "I'm here," the voice said, its tone filled with desperation. "Help me." "That's impossible," Vega muttered, her hands tightening on the console. How is she broadcasting through the interference? "It's not her," Darnell said firmly. "It's this place, trying to mess with us." "I'm not so sure," I said, staring at the swirling lights of the nebula. The whispers felt too real, too personal. The radar lit up again, this time with a cluster of massive objects ahead. Through the viewport, I could just make out the faint outlines of derelict ships, their hulks drifting lifelessly through the nebula. "Graveyard," Jenkins said, his voice barely a whisper. "Scavenger's dream," Torik added, his tone lighter than it should have been. "This is what we came for. We didn't come to loot," I snapped. "We're looking for Vega's outpost." "Your priorities, not mine," Torik replied, his voice crackling with amusement. "You'll find what you're looking for, or it'll find you." The derelict ships were a haunting sight. Some were ancient, their designs predating even the oldest colonial records. Others were more recent, their hulls scarred by plasma burns and claw marks that made my stomach turn. "It's like they were attacked," Vega said, her voice trembling. "They were," I said grimly, watching as one of the derelict ships drifted past, its lights flickering weakly. The signal grew stronger as we approached the center of the graveyard. Nestled among the wreckage was the outpost, a massive, ring-shaped structure that seemed untouched by time or the horrors around it. "It's still operational," Darnell said, his voice filled with disbelief. "How is that possible?" "It's a trap," Jenkins muttered, clutching his rifle like a lifeline. Probably, I admitted, but it's also our only lead. We docked cautiously, the nebula's grace two locking onto one of the outpost's docking arms. The airlock hissed open and a wave of cold, stale air greeted us. The interior of the outpost was pristine, its corridors lined with sleek, metallic walls that gleamed under the faint glow of emergency lights. But there was something wrong about it. Doesn't look abandoned, Vega said, her voice echoing slightly. It's not, Torque said, stepping in behind us. His crew followed, their weapons drawn, and their eyes scanning every shadow. Places like this don't get abandoned. They get claimed. By what? Darnell asked, his tone wary. Torque smirked. You'll see. As we moved deeper into the outpost, the whispers returned, louder and more distinct. They weren't just voices anymore. They were memories, fragments of conversations I'd had with Vega before her disappearance. Rogers. We're running out of time. The sound of her voice was like a dagger to the heart, but I couldn't let it distract me. Stay focused, I said, gripping my rifle tightly. The corridors twisted in unnatural ways, bending and looping back on themselves. No matter how far we walked, it felt like we weren't getting any closer to the signal's source. It's like the place is alive, Jenkins muttered, his breath fogging in the cold air. It is, Torque said simply, his cybernetic eye scanning the walls. This isn't just an outpost. It's part of the Veil. The shadows struck without warning, their forms rising from the corners of the room like living smoke. They didn't move like the creatures we'd encountered outside. These were faster, more deliberate, their attacks precise and unrelenting. Contact, I shouted, firing into the nearest shadow. The plasma bolt passed through it, the creature reforming instantly. It lunged at Vega, its claws scraping against her armor before Darnell fired, driving it back. They're adapting, Vega yelled, pulling Jenkins behind cover as another shadow descended from the ceiling. Torque's crew fought viciously, their crude weapons lighting up the room in bursts of orange and red. This is what I warned you about, Rogers, Torque shouted, blasting a shadow into a mist of black smoke. This place doesn't let go. The creatures retreated as quickly as they had appeared, melting back into the walls and leaving us breathless and battered. We need to move, I said, reloading my rifle. The signal's coming from the lower levels. Lower levels? Jenkins asked, his voice filled with dread. There's more to this place. There's always more, Torque said, his grin returning despite the blood dripping from a gash on his cheek. Welcome to the Veil. We descended into the heart of the outpost, the lights dimming with every step. The air grew colder and the whispers louder until they weren't just in our ears. They were in our heads. The lower levels of the outpost were a stark contrast to the pristine corridors above. Here, the walls were covered in strange, pulsating veins that glowed faintly with an eerie blue light. The air was colder, thicker, and every breath felt like inhaling ice. The whispers weren't just sounds anymore. They were thoughts, pushing their way into my mind like parasites. You left her, you left them all. I shook my head, trying to drown out the voices. Stay focused, I said, though my own voice sounded distant hollow. Captain, Vega said, her hand gripping my shoulder. Are you hearing this? Yeah, I muttered. It's the Veil. It's trying to mess with us. That's not all it's doing, Darnell said, pointing at the walls. The veins were moving, twitching as if they were alive. What the hell is this place? Jenkins asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The heart of something we weren't meant to find, Torque said, his usual bravado replaced with a grim determination. Let's hope we can leave it behind. We reached a massive chamber at the bottom of the outpost. The air was so cold that frost clung to our visors, and the faint glow from the walls cast flickering shadows that seemed to move on their own. In the center of the chamber was a monolith, its surface covered in the same glowing veins that lined the walls. Around it, The shadows writhed, their forms shifting and flickering like smoke caught in a storm. "This is it," Vega said, her voice trembling. "This is the source of the signal." The whispers grew louder, deafening, as if the monolith was screaming directly into our minds. "Get it out of my head," Jenkins shouted, clutching his helmet. "It's not real," I said, trying to steady him. "Focus." The shadows began to move, detaching from the walls and the monolith. They weren't just creatures. They were the veil itself, its essence given form. "They're coming," Darnell shouted. Raising his rifle, the room erupted into chaos as the shadows attacked. Plasma bolts lit up the chamber, but the creatures were relentless, reforming faster than we could destroy them. "They're endless," Jenkins yelled, firing wildly. "No! They're feeding off the monolith," Vega shouted. "It's the source. They're connected to it." "Then we destroy it," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos. "Cover me." I ran toward the monolith, dodging tendrils of shadow that lashed out at me. Each step felt heavier, the weight of the veil pressing down on me like a physical force. "Keep them off him," Torek barked, his crew forming a defensive line around the monolith. The whispers intensified, and for a moment, I thought I saw Vega, my Vega, standing in front of the monolith. Her face was pale, her eyes empty. "You left me," she said, her voice echoing in my mind. I hesitated, but only for a moment. "You're not real," I said, raising my rifle. Her form dissolved into smoke as I fired. The plasma bolt striking the base of the monolith pulsed with a blinding light, and the shadows screamed as if in pain. The veins along the walls turned black, their glow fading. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it," Darnell shouted, firing at the creatures as they began to retreat. I planted a thermal charge at the base of the monolith, its timer ticking down. "Everyone fall back," I yelled, running toward the exit. The shadows surged toward us, their desperation palpable as they tried to stop us. Move, Torek shouted, firing his shotgun into the swarm. The charge detonated, and the monolith shattered, releasing a wave of energy that tore through the chamber. The shadows disintegrated, their forms collapsing into wisps of smoke that were sucked back into the walls. The ground beneath us trembled, cracks spidering out from the remains of the monolith. "This place is coming down," Vega shouted. We sprinted through the collapsing corridors, the walls crumbling around us. The glowing veins were dead now, their light extinguished, but the whispers lingered, faint and accusing. "You'll never escape. The veil is forever." The docking bay was a chaotic mess as debris rained down from the ceiling. The Nebula's Grace 2 and the Scavenger's Fong were still intact, though barely. "Get on the ship," I shouted, covering my crew as they boarded. Torek's crew followed, their faces grim but determined. "You owe me for this, Rogers," Torek said as he passed. "I'll put it on your tab," I replied, firing one last shot at a lingering shadow before diving into the airlock. The Nebula's Grace 2 lifted off just as the outpost collapsed entirely, disappearing into the swirling mist of the veil. The silence aboard the ship was deafening as we left the Nebula behind. My crew sat in the mess hall, their faces pale and drawn. Even Torek and his pirates seemed subdued, their usual bravado gone. "What the hell was that place?" Jenkins asked finally, his voice trembling. "A graveyard," Vega said, and we almost joined it. I stared out the viewport at the swirling colors of the veil, my thoughts racing. The monolith was gone, but the veil wasn't. It was still there, watching, waiting. "We're not done with this," I said quietly. "The veil doesn't let go that easily." Torek chuckled darkly. "You're right about that, Rogers. But next time, you'll face it without me." I didn't respond. The whispers in my head were faint now, but they hadn't disappeared. And I couldn't shake the feeling that Vega's voice, her real voice, was still out there, calling for help. "This is Captain John Rogers of the Nebula's Grace 2. Mission to the Veil Nebula. concluded, but not without cost. We destroyed the source of the shadow creatures, but the Veil is still out there, and I don't think we've seen the last of it. The pirates were helpful, but this alliance came at a price I'll have to pay eventually. To anyone who hears this, if you find yourself near the Veil Nebula, turn back. Until next time, stay curious, and keep looking up